Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to Wild Apricots Expert Webinar Series. If you want to type in your chat box, if you can hear me okay, that'd be great. We are thrilled to have today's expert webinar presenter, John Matone, joining us today. And John is going to tell us how to build a culture of leadership in 6 steps. So while I see people logging on, I'd just like to quickly introduce myself. My name's Lori Smith. I'm the community manager here at Wild Apricot. And on chat is Terry Ibell, our content manager. He can help you with any technical questions or questions in general. And we ask that you provide comments or questions throughout the webinar in your chat box. And we'll be pausing every few slides just to check in and see what you're thinking and if you have some thoughts. If you're into Twitter, we're also live tweeting during this webinar, and you can use the hashtag WildWebinar, which is down on the left-hand corner of the screen there, and you can use our handle at Wild Apricot or John Matone's handle at John Matone. Also, quick reminder, if you are building up your accreditation, you can get a credit by attending today's webinar, and Terry will just quickly share a link in the chat so you can read more about that if that's something you want to learn about. And we will be recording this and sharing it with you tomorrow. So just be patient. You'll be getting everything in an email, any links mentioned, slides, everything in an email tomorrow. So when you've registered for this webinar, we asked you what your biggest leadership challenges are. And we thought it'd be fun to share just a couple of your answers. So this is a few of them. So getting people to step up so you don't have to micromanage. And sometimes it's people doing everything. So how do you change that? Some of you are struggling with changing outdated mindsets. So maybe they don't want to try new ideas or new technology. So how do you share your vision and get people excited and buying into that? And for a lot of us, leadership comes down to board recruitment or finding the right leaders to engage with and lead your organization in a great way. And then, of course, some of you have a lot of self-doubt. So how do you be a leader yourself? So to speak to these issues today is John Matone, and he is widely recognized as one of the world's leading authorities on leadership, talent, and culture. He has over 30 years of experience and has advised senior leadership teams on how to create and sustain leadership and talent culture that drives results. He's published more than 8 books on the topic, 3 of them bestsellers, and he just recently published and launched Cultural Transformations, which he'll talk about today. And outside of work, I apologize, this slide is not updated, but outside of work, John has 4 children and 1 grandson, of whom he spends a lot of time with, and he works out a lot. He does cycle, spin, yoga, and Pilates, so he's a fit guy. So John, I am going to make sure that you are unmuted here and introduce you to everyone. John, welcome to Wild Apricot's Expert Webinar Series. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lori, and what a great introduction. Thank you so much. And Terry, great to be working with you. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I'm very excited about sharing some great information on leadership and culture.
Great. So, John, I just switched presenter control to you, so you should see that.
Okay. Okay. Can everybody, Laura, can everybody see that first slide?
Yes, we can, and we can hear you great too.
Oh, that's wonderful. Very, very good. So here's the first slide, everybody. I'm very excited to announce that the book that you see right there in the middle, Cultural Transformations, that Lori referenced, officially released yesterday. And we're very excited about the release of this book. You can see the other 2 books. Those 2 books were written in the last 3 years as well. So I've been really busy writing and speaking and consulting and doing quite a bit of executive coaching all over the world. I want to share with you that the book that you see in the middle, we're going to talk about today. One of the things that I recognized a couple of years ago when I was writing Intelligent Leadership was that there continue to be massive gaps all over the world in organizations, associations, struggling with gaps in two areas. One, leadership, and number two, culture. As I looked around, I didn't really see that many tremendous resources out there that we could tap into to help us solve a lot of those issues. And I appreciate everybody also writing in the current challenges that you're faced with, and my hope is that we can address many of those in this webinar. And oh, by the way, if we don't address a particular question at the end, certainly, well, actually, my email I'll share later, but it's very easy to reach me. I would love to engage with you and help you any way that I can. So, some of you might be aware of this. There was an incredible research study that came out by Deloitte and also was replicated by PricewaterhouseCoopers. These are two major consulting firms. This is about a year and a half ago that confirmed the observations that I was seeing as I was traveling around the globe around leadership and culture. And those research studies said exactly what I just said, that when you look at organizations that are struggling in terms of transforming themselves to becoming more innovative, more creative, more member-oriented, organizations that desire to go from good to great and from great to greatest, and we all share that. We all share that desire. It doesn't matter what organization I talk to. Everybody wants to get better, and that's a noble pursuit. So I wrote this book. It was a challenge to write it, but we are really pleased with what we've got. And just to share real quick, I interviewed 14 of the top CEOs in the world. And what I wanted to do was I hand-selected, it was actually myself and my co-author, 14 CEOs who were perhaps flying under the radar, meaning that they may not be the quote-unquote rock star CEOs like a Jeff Bezos at Amazon, but these were people who were doing amazing things in their organizations, developing talent, developing strong leaders and future leaders, and creating cultures in their organizations that were incredibly strong and vibrant. So we went through a massive research study identifying who were these 14 people who were just doing amazing things, and we came up with really a global list of incredible people. I'm not going to reference all of them. Obviously, we don't have enough time, but very quickly, in the book, there's a chapter on Kathy Mazzarella. Kathy Mazzarella is one of the 20 female Fortune 500 CEOs that we've got in the world. Kathy is CEO of Graybar. I spent a tremendous amount of time with a gentleman by the name of Tiger Tyagarajan, very tough name. But Tiger is the CEO of a company called Genpact. Genpact is a company that was a spinoff from GE a number of years ago, 60,000 employees. I interviewed Chris Kanakaratney, who is the CEO of Virtusa, one of the fastest growing IT consulting firms in the world. And I interviewed some CEOs in the Middle East, but I also wanted to make sure that we captured the essence of association executive leadership and the challenges that are faced by associations. And for that, I was very much interested in talking with Russ Klein, who is the CEO of the American Marketing Association. He's been in that role for about a year. And listen to this, everybody. He was brought in to transform that culture. And I want to share, as we progress in our partnership here today, working through some of these slides, what I was able to learn from these 14 CEOs, and Russ Klein included, that I think you're going to find very interesting, very powerful, and most importantly, that you can apply in your respective associations. I'd like to transition and talk very briefly about this gentleman. And we all know who he is. This is a very powerful story. Some of you might be aware of this story, but in 1997, Steve Jobs came back to Apple. He had been away 15 years. He went away at age 25. He came back at age 40. He came back a totally transformed person and leader. He grew tremendously in those 15 years, and there were a lot of reasons why he did transform as a person. But in 1997, he took the platform in Cupertino, California. He was so excited to be back in front of his people. And I want to share with you what he said. This is exactly what he said. He said, you know, our success at Apple, in fact, has very little to do with the computer. Actually, he didn't use the word computer. He called it a box. He said, our success at Apple has everything to do with how we build rapport, trust, and credibility with our stakeholders and our customers. We must build rapport, trust, and credibility, and the only way we're going to do that is through incredible leadership. We all need to be leaders. We need to create a culture of talent, and we need to create together in partnership a strong and vibrant culture that's going to drive operating success. That's what Steve Jobs said in 1997 at age 40. On this particular day, he unveiled a marketing campaign. The marketing campaign was called the Think Different campaign. Perhaps will go down as the most incredible marketing campaign ever conceived and implemented in the world. We're not going to talk about it today. But I want to share something else. In 2010, I do quite a bit of executive coaching at the highest level. I'm very privileged to have the opportunity to work with a number of executive directors and CEOs as they try to get better themselves and they try to make their organization stronger. 2010. And Steve Jobs was really in the last year of his life. I had the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with Steve Jobs because he took an assessment that I created. And he was very curious about the results. And I was able to learn, as I talked to him about that particular speech in 1997, I was able to learn from Steve Jobs something very amazing, which was this. The Think Different campaign was real. It was very real. However, he really used that marketing campaign symbolically to share with the world all that he had learned in his 15 years being away. He could not wait to share with his people and the world all that he had learned. And so symbolically, what he was trying to say that day, and I think he was very effective in saying it, was, hey, guess what, everybody? If you want to get different results in business and in your personal life, you need to think differently. And if you want to get big results in your personal and your professional life, you need to think big. And so it is with what I was able to learn talking to these incredible people, these incredible CEOs who were strong and vibrant individuals, great character, great values, incredible thinking patterns, everybody, strong emotional makeup, leaders who exhibited strong leadership skills. What I was able to learn was that if you want to transform your organization, and this is true for every association listening in today, that if you want to transform your association, you cannot think small, and you can't think the same. It is an imperative. Actually, it's a non-negotiable. That if you want to transform your association into something special, into something that's going to be incredible, you've got to be able to think different and think big. And that starts, obviously, with the board of directors, and it also goes, obviously, to the executive director, the CEO, and the entire leadership, and the entire organization that supports your membership. So thinking different and thinking big is, I believe, the most important step that we can take to transform not only ourselves as leaders, but also our associations. There's no room for thinking small. So that's what I was able to learn in my interviews with 14 CEOs. And by the way, I do want to share this. My book is not an interview book. It's not boring. What I was able to do, because I do executive coaching, was actually create executive coaching conversations where these people were very open, sharing about their setbacks and their failures and their successes, and what they're doing in their organizations to transform their organizations into something special. They were people who were willing and able to open up and share some incredible things. Step number one, we want to transform ourselves and we want to transform our associations. There's no question that culture and positive culture starts with leadership. And when I talk about culture, I want to share a definition. The culture that exists in your association, even in your family, is a combination of a number of things that make your organization up. It starts with self-concept. It starts with what is your character. So if you're an executive director and you're listening in today, I would say this, that your culture starts with you. And when you look at the inner core that makes you up, it includes things like your self-concept and your character and your value system and how strong and vibrant your thinking patterns are. Are you positive? What about your emotional makeup? Is that strong and vibrant? What kind of behaviors do you exhibit in your organization? When you look at your culture, it starts with all of those elements. And when you look at the culture from an aggregate standpoint in your association, you can take a look at the inner core and the outer core of all the people and all the members in your organization. That defines your culture. My experience is this, and this was reflected and certainly reinforced in the 14 interviews, that if you want a strong culture, we need to recognize that our culture ultimately is going to drive operating success. Now, if we were having this conversation literally 3 to 5 years ago, what I would hear from executive directors and CEOs all over the world is, John, seriously, culture is a soft thing. Well, no longer. Most executive directors, most CEOs recognize that if they get culture right and they have people in their organization who have the right character and the right values and the right behaviors, guess what? It's going to drive operating success. In fact, culture is probably the most challenging job that exists in an association. Establishing, creating, sustaining, and nurturing a powerful, strong, and vibrant culture. It starts with great leadership. That's step number one. So let's talk a little bit about this. We do need great leaders. We have a major gap all over the world. And what's amazing is, despite all the books that have been written on leadership, I know many of you have read many books. I've actually contributed a few of these books. That despite all the books and all the seminars and all the university programs that exist all over the world, we still have a major gap in leadership. But that's not true with intelligence. When you look at raw intellect in your association, and you look at raw intellect in businesses all over the world, there's no question that we've done a better job because most associations have a skewed distribution. When you look up the makeup of the people in your associations, they are intelligent people. It is a skewed distribution. But when we look at leadership in your associations, we don't have a skewed distribution. What we've got is a normal distribution. And when you look at the challenges and the disruption that's existing in your industries, and certainly the association industry is disruptive, I think we'd agree on that. We need leaders who are going to be the best of the best. Now, what do I mean by the best of the best? Leaders, we need to ask ourselves and think about leadership as being much more than things like spreadsheets. Leadership is so much bigger than spreadsheets. It's bigger than big data. It's bigger than analysis. What we need to do is we need to ask ourselves, going back to the Steve Jobs example, we need to actually ask ourselves bigger and better questions. And I'm asked all the time, John, what are you talking about here? What kind of questions do I need to ask of myself so that I am a role model to my people and our members? Well, here's a question that we need to ask ourselves. And when we ask ourselves these questions, it automatically pushes us to a higher level of leadership. Am I a role model? Am I truly a role model? Am I a magnet? Am I somebody that when I walk into my business, people are attracted to me? People want to be around me because they get energized being around me. They learn as a result of being. Are you a role model? Are you a role model every single day? We need to ask ourselves that question. Here's another question that we need to ask ourselves. What's my legacy? That's a question that automatically forces you to play at a much higher level. How do you want your life remembered? There's a question. Those questions force us. They are bigger and better questions. So the question is, how do we become a role model? Well, we certainly do need to ask ourselves bigger questions, but it starts in the inner core. It starts with great character, and it starts with great values. Character is very complicated, but there's no question, I think we'd all agree, we would all agree that your character will determine your ultimate destiny. And in your association, if you've got people of character, it's going to drive your destiny of success. It is a non-negotiable. What do I mean by character? Well, I would say this, that one thing that we need to establish is that there is a major difference between something called fearlessness and courage. And when I look at great leaders, I see people who are able and willing and have the courage and the guts to make a tough decision, to get out of their comfort zone, to take a reasonable risk. We have too many leaders, and often I see this in the younger people, the talented young people, the future leaders that you need to cultivate. I often see them confusing character or courage and fearlessness. Fearlessness is a very, very different construct. Fearlessness only exists in somebody's mind and heart. What you want to do is you want to have people taking reasonable risks and taking action. Courage is in fact an instigator. It is the only instigator. It's the key to unleashing agility. We all want agile learners in our association. We want people who are going to embrace the changes that you want to implement. We want people who are going to build powerful relationships with stakeholders and members. How in the world can we do that unless we have courage? Courage is an instigator of agility. That's what I mean by character. It also includes things like there's no substitute for working hard. I think we'd all agree. Diligence is a character element, non-negotiable. Gratitude, going up to your people and your members and saying thank you. Going to your family members, thank you. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today if it wasn't for you. We need more gratitude. We need honesty, loyalty, modesty. Those are the essence. That's the essence of character. That starts with the executive director and the CEO. And then obviously the right mindset and the right actions. You know what's really interesting, everybody? Whatever exists in your mind, whatever thinking patterns that you've got, whether they're good, bad, or indifferent, will strongly impact the emotions that you feel. So if your thinking patterns are I can, I will, and I must, or even better, we can, we will, we must, positive thinking patterns, it generates emotions of exhilaration and excitement, passion, which then generates positive behaviors, which then generates positive results and a positive culture. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but very important that we understand this.
So
anyway,
John, can I just interrupt quickly? Because everything you're saying is amazing, and some of the feedback I'm getting from the executives listening in right now is that, you know, they're actually the ones managing a board, and it's often the board that has the power. So how do you, as an executive, you know, instill some of the things you just said and lead the board to kind of be leaders themselves? Or how would you apply some of these lessons in that kind of structure?
Yeah, I think what we can do, Lori, I'm going to hit this real quick, and then as we go, I think I'm going to put some more depth on this. There's no question that we've got to be able to manage to the board. And ultimately, these themes of that we're going to be talking about are things that we want the board members to embrace as well. And I got to tell you, one of the best things that you can do as a leader is actually have a brown bag lunch, okay? And actually take this presentation that we're doing today, Lori, and sit around with your board, sit around with your executives, and actually share a lot of these concepts that we're talking about and get things out on the table. That is the best thing in the world to do. Now, there's other things that you can do as well, but I think it's what's going to instigate positive problem solving in this is getting it out on the table and getting some of these ideas being talked about. That's what I would say.
Sounds good. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Lori. Okay, so anyway, in my book, I talk about, and by the way, it's just not all interviews. The first 3 or 4 chapters, I talk about my research that I've done the last 2 or 3 years on culture and what drives a positive culture. So anyway, I've got this 3C predictive pyramid, 5 cultures of culture. So ultimately, the success in any organization is based upon what I call leading indicators, okay? Not like an economic analogy. On the lower left-hand side, you'll see something called can do, and then you'll see will do and must do, capability, commitment, and connectedness. Great leaders create organizations where people have a belief that they have the skills and the capability to execute what needs to be executed to drive the organization forward. So the question that's very important to understand is to what extent, and your board's included on this as well, does everybody in your association truly believe that they do have the skills and the competencies required to drive your vision forward? That's called the capability or can-do culture. That culture exists in your association. If it is strong and vibrant, that's a good thing. If it is not strong and vibrant, not a good thing. It's almost like an engine. So if that engine is operating really strong, same thing in your family, by the way. If you've got this existing in your family's going to be stronger. Commitment is the passion, it's the drive, it's the motivation, it's the zeal to make a difference. To what extent does that belief exist in your people? It's the will-do culture. Connectedness or the must-do culture is the extent to which people feel aligned, everybody, with the mission and the vision and the purpose of what it is that you're trying to get done in your association. Can do, will do, must do are the 3 leading indicators that drive operating success. And here's what's very interesting. What I was able to uncover in my research is that if those 3 engines are working well, here's what you create. You create a 4th culture. And that 4th culture is called the individual performance or success culture. It's the culture of execution, where in reality you start to see individuals doing great things. And then you create something called the team culture or the collaborative culture, team success culture. Those 5 cultures drive success in any organization. Now here's the interesting thing. There are a lot of associations that I know measure engagement levels. 75% of organizations that I work with measure engagement. Yet here's the issue. Only about 15% of organizations worldwide measure culture and how strong and vibrant their culture is. But guess what? Guess what drives engagement? It's culture. Culture drives engagement. Engagement drives operating success. It's a call to action for each leader listening in that we need to calibrate. We need to measure the strength and vibrancy of these 5 cultures to see where we're strong, to see where we're weak, so that we can make course correction. It's a very interesting thing that I discovered. Everybody wants to transform, right? Everybody sitting in, talking today and listening to what I'm talking about, say, how do we transform our association? Well, here's the thing. It's going to be very difficult to transform your association consistent with your operating imperative unless these 5 cultures are strong and vibrant. So I'm going to make sure that I hit that with some strength, but let me move to the next slide. And I want to share with you the most powerful, really, literally, one of the big things that I guess that I learned interviewing these 14 CEOs. And also my great interview, I think, with Russ Klein, who is an absolutely amazing senior executive. The most powerful leadership truth is that failure almost always precedes success, yet the most powerful leadership irony is that success is often the first step to failure. So here's what I discovered, and Russ Klein included. And everybody listening in, we all fail. In fact, we all have failed a lot. I think one thing that a lot of people look at when they look at successful people, they tend to forget the massive trial and error and setbacks and disappointments. And all 14 of these CEOs that I met with, they shared their stories of setback and failure. And these are people who just never gave, just like you. You wouldn't be listening today unless you were just like these people. You don't ever give up. Don't ever give up. Yet the most powerful leadership irony is that success is often the first step to failure. Here's what I discovered. There's 2 issues here. How in the world can success lead to failure? Well, there's 2 things happening. And I'll bet they're happening in your association. One is something called distraction. It's very easy when you're successful to become distracted, whether you're a person or an association or a profit business. Because what happens is you're presented with opportunities. So here's what happens. Hey, you're good at something, and then you're presented with opportunities. And what I've discovered is, and again, these 14 CEOs, they taught me a heck of a lot. I learned that in reality, it's the disciplined pursuit of less, everybody, that gives us more. It's very tempting to get caught up with all kinds of opportunities. The problem is that it takes our eye off the ball, and distraction does lead to diluted effort and focus, which then leads to death. We don't need to look any further than a book that was written 14 years ago by Jim Collins, a good friend of mine. His first book, Good to Great. Just go back to that book when we're done with the webinar today and go back to the companies that he talked about, the organizations that were referenced as organizations that we need to look to for guidance. 14 years ago, everybody. Guess what? Some of those organizations do not exist anymore. Why? Because they became distracted. Enron got distracted big time. What about Motorola? Motorola was a company 14 years ago that was operating on all cylinders. Not anymore. And there are many other examples. The second issue is something called complacency, where individuals, leaders, and organizations start to kind of get too comfortable. They take things for granted. They tend to get in a comfort zone. They kind of rest on their laurels. And in reality, what we need to think about if we're going to transform is that your comfort zone, individually as well as in aggregate, in your association, whatever comfort zone you're in, you need to disrupt it. I'm going to say that again. Whatever comfort zone you're existing in, you need to disrupt it. Because in the world of associations, and you know this better than I do, your world is one of disruption. The only way to combat disruption as a leader is to have a disruptive mindset. And you need to be a role model for your board and your staff in actually embracing and understanding and implementing this disruptive mindset and skills. So what do I mean by this? Well, I've got 6 things that I want to work through very quickly. And The first one, obviously, we've just talked about, which is this. You need to disrupt your comfort zone. You need to disrupt the pleasure, if you will, of the comfort zone that exists. We almost need to think of our comfort zone as one that is actually, it's a disease in reality, because we can't continue to sustain ourselves staying where we're at. So what I see in great leaders, and I certainly saw in the 14 CEOs that I interviewed, and I certainly saw it in Russ Klein, was the imperative and passion to constantly disrupt comfort zones and never really create a situation where everybody gets too comfortable. The only way to do that is by making sure that your culture is one where everybody is thinking different and thinking big and excited about thinking differently and thinking big. We need to be vulnerable. To what extent are you willing to raise your hand as the executive director and say, you know something? I'm very open to feedback. I recognize that I've got gifts and strengths, but I also recognize I got things to work on. To what extent, as an association, are you open, obviously, to your member feedback? As one example, vulnerability has got to be established individually at the executive level. It also needs to be implemented and established from an aggregate standpoint. Vulnerability is the key to continuous learning, growth, and innovation. In those executives where I see that they have a problem making the vulnerability decision, I don't see a great leader. And by the way, it's the same thing with parenting. For the parents listening in today, ultimately, great parents are people who are vulnerable. And what they do is they teach in their children the value of vulnerability. Hey, to what extent are you leveraging your gifts and strengths and addressing your leadership gaps? Very important that we do that. By the way, most executives tend to take their gifts for granted. Really what we need to do is take a look at our gifts and strengths and say, you know something, they've served me well. I need to continue to polish these gifts and strengths. The courage to execute, going back to what we said before, is that mindset of courage and being courageous something that's a mindset that exists in your association? Does it exist throughout? Because that mindset is going to be the instigator to being agile around learning and growth and being innovative and learning. Is your mindset one of, you know something, I'm very privileged to be leading a group of people. I'm very privileged to touch this massive stakeholder group, our membership population. This is truly a privilege. My mindset is one of privilege. And when you've got a mindset of privilege, you take nothing for granted. By the way, the 14 CEOs that I interviewed, nothing was handed to any one of these people. These people were not rich people. When you read the Russ Klein interview, you're going to be amazed at his background. He was working at age 10. He was working at age 10. Chris Canacaratney was working at age 10. These people have taken nothing for granted. They show up at work the next day and they say, you know something, this could end tomorrow. So the privileged mindset is a very healthy mindset to have as a leader, especially leading your associations. Are we vigilant as we execute? Do we keep our eyes open? To what extent are we impacting? How am I impacting the people around me? And then obviously the ability to course correct. These are the 6 constructs that I believe make you a transformational leader. And when you think about, again, the disruptive world that we are operating in, and certainly the world of associations, these are the 6 constructs that you need to live, that you need to embrace, that you need to execute, and that you need to coach in your people. Lori, I'm going to stop right there and just kind of see where we're at. And we've got, what, another 10 minutes or so?
Yeah, we've got another good 10 or 15 minutes. But I do have a few comments coming in. So when you say vulnerability, what do you mean by that? That's a question from Pam.
Yeah, Pam, that's a great question. You know, really what I'm talking about there is just a willingness to be open to feedback. So, you know, if you're if your mindset is one where, okay, I'm very open to feedback, I have a choice to accept or reject the feedback, right? But if we reject that choice, we reject another important choice, which is the choice that goes with behaving in a different way that can actually yield more abundance for you as a leader and your association. So that's what I mean by that.
Great. That's a great answer. And I see your next slide is, looking more at behaviors, which is good. That was sort of my question. But here we have a question about, is there any way you can measure the current culture at your organization or association? Like, is there a tool that you can use, or how do you even determine where you're at in the first place?
Yeah. Wonderful question, and yes, you can. What I did was, because my background's industrial psychology, Lori, I know a lot about assessment, and I've built many assessments. So it's what I did parallel to writing the book. I created an assessment that I validated. It's called the 5 Cultures of Culture Assessment. In fact, I'm going over to the Middle East in 2 weeks. I'm going to be working with an organization over there, working through the results. So I don't want to just stand here today and say, hey, just look at my assessment. But my assessment measures those 5 cultures, how strong and vibrant they are, and what you need to do to course correct. But there's another gentleman who's a very good friend of mine, by the way. His name is Dennison, and some of you might be familiar with Dennison, the Dennison Culture Assessment. That's also a very good tool. So there's some options out there. Anybody who wants to connect with me, though, certainly shoot me an email, and I can send you some information on the 5 Cultures of Culture Assessment.
Okay, sounds good. Let's keep it going, but everyone, please ask your questions, and we'll have more time to chat about it towards the end.
Yeah, that's great, Lori. And some of these slides are going to start to go a little bit quick. I'm always asked by executives, how do I disrupt myself? And this slide looks complicated. In reality, it's actually pretty simple. I don't think that you can disrupt yourself. I don't think that you can become the best that you can be as a leader unless you are willing to be assessed. And I think, you've got in the oval there the willingness to do a 360-degree assessment. I don't know if some of you are using 360s, but I think it's very important to get a view from the stakeholders. And by the way, Russ Klein actually implements this exact slide in his organization. He wants the feedback himself. So he's instituting a 360. And the 360 assessment is given out to 18 to 20 of the stakeholders and members. And what happens is they will give him feedback on his outer core, which are the skills of executive leadership, right? Critical thinking skills, decision making, and so on and so forth. The inner core, which you see in the triangle, also needs to be measured. And the inner core gets the things that we just talked about, like character and values. And thinking patterns, and so on and so forth. And you can see that when I work with an executive, I want the ability to combine those 2 assessments, and then you've got a 4-quadrant system. And ultimately, when you look at any executive, we want to identify these 4 quadrants. What are the indisputable strengths? What are the surprise strengths, surprise development needs, indisputable development needs? And all of that will drive what you need to do as a leader to get better. That's how you disrupt yourself, and it never ends. I wanted to share, though, real quick, just a real quick excerpt from the Russ Klein interview, because something that he said was very, very powerful. I asked him, and this is actually in the chapter, I said, Russ, I read the blog post that you wrote about curiosity. Essentially, you said that without curiosity, there will be no success. And I went on to say, I love that post. And this is what Russ Klein said. Yes, it is a highly stakeholder-driven position that I'm in as CEO of the American Marketing Association. We are very complex in terms of all the various constituent groups that we are committed to extending our service and thought leadership. As part of our strategic platform, of which the first plank is something called service leadership. Everybody stay with me on this. Very, very important. We also operate on what we call a be-do basis, in quotes. That means it is more critical to be grateful and joyful and curious and courageous, customer-centric and stakeholder-sensitive than it is to do anything. Do I need to say any more? The essence of great leadership, spoken by Russ Klein, starts with strength on the inside. And really, that's what this slide is getting at, Lori. All right, I'm gonna move now to the next slide. And some of these slides are going to go pretty quick because I think we've already built a pretty good foundation here. It's not about the organization, the association that you want to create. That's irrelevant. And when I start to hear CEOs and executive directors and C-level teams saying, you know, what do we want to create? My answer always is, who cares? Nobody really cares. Really, it's about the organization, the association that we must create. And the question is, what creates the must? Well, it's your membership population. So we don't want to get too caught up in want. The more important criteria is we got to hold ourselves to a higher standard. What must we create? What is this entity, this incredible entity with this incredible compelling future that we must create? That's law number one. The vulnerability decision is certainly step number two. Positive transformation ignites. By the way, this is individually as well as collectively. When the ideology of comfort, a lot of words here, and the tyranny of custom are more painful than the ideology of different. When do people change? People change when they feel the pain. That's when people change. And many leaders don't understand that if we're going to get somebody from their comfort zone, which people associate with pleasure, right? People were in their comfort zone. Hey, this is fun. This is pleasurable. But great leaders disrupt that zone. So what you need to do is actually create pain in the comfort zone. That's what great leaders do. But what they do is they say, guess what? There's a compelling alternative. And that compelling alternative is going to yield more pleasure. And then you've got to be very influential in getting your people to see, guess what? That compelling alternative is a heck of a lot better than my old comfort zone. That's the essence of transformation. So how do you fight that disease of the comfort zone? You got to get people to actually feel the pain. It's much more than a mental thing. You got to get people to feel the pain. But you also need to create a compelling future. What is your vision? Actually, what must your vision be? Back to the must. What must your strategy be? What must your structure and systems be? What must your roles be? What must the competencies be in your leaders and the board and your staff members? It's all about must. How do you create that compelling future? And it's been my experience that the compelling future is always created by the leadership team and the board. That you must accept responsibility for creating the compelling future blueprint architecture. But that's it. Who's responsible for putting meat on the architecture and the blueprint? Well, it's your team and it's your members. So you want to create an environment, a community. And in fact, if you don't mind, I'm going to share what Russ Klein said along these lines. It starts with a vision in which people see themselves as having a starring role, quote unquote. To me, that was what was important foundation for us to lay out. So we went through a process of what I call stakeholder-built strategic planning. It's a function of lots of listening, lots of input, and ultimately allowed us to articulate a vision in which people could see their own ideas and their own inputs reflected in it. And they could see how they fit into that vision. That was job number one. So, when you look at it, step number 4, results will transform only when your culture transforms. I've written this book called Cultural Transformations. In reality, it's about transforming your entity, transforming your association, becoming more innovative. That's the ultimate goal. But you must have a culture that supports that operating imperative. Culture will only transform when you have behavior transforming, and ultimately behavior only transforms when mindsets transform. How do you do this? How do you put meat on the structure? Clear messaging about gifts and gaps, the imperative to transform, all the things that Russ Klein talks about in his chapter. Cascading town hall meetings with members to reinforce messaging, cascading focus groups, empowering everybody to operationalize the blueprint. Talent. It's all about talent. If you've got the right talent, you're going to support your compelling future. And I've got this diagram, and you'll be able to look at it when you get the copies. But ultimately, look at the leading indicators, everybody, of the 5 cultures of culture. The capability culture, the alignment culture, the commitment culture, the individual performance culture, team performance culture. Those 5 cultures ultimately is based upon how you deploy people, how you select and promote people, how you diagnose and measure people, and you measure culture. To what extent are you developing your people and measuring people and rewarding people? All of those 4 engines drive ultimately the 5 cultures of culture. It's always about talent. And then ultimately, step number 6 is about measure, and don't ever forget to course correct. Almost everybody measures engagement. Very few organizations are measuring culture. Yet it is culture that drives engagement, and it is engagement that drives operating success. Here's the infographic that's in the book. You'll see the 6 steps. And then obviously the foundation is the stealth. I call it the stealth because it looks like a stealth airplane. This model around talent is the foundation of it all. I will share with you that I went into my project with a theory around these 6 steps. And really, I was looking for corroboration and validation as I talked to profit-oriented companies, and then obviously the association business, Russ Klein and the AMA. And what we were able to discover was that these 6 steps drive transformation in any business, any business, any business. But ultimately, the key is recognizing that these 6 steps need to be understood, they need to be embraced, and then they need to be implemented. And so I went into the project with a theory. And through the 14 interviews, you know what we did? We validated the model. Because what I did in the book was, as CEOs talked about how they were trying to transform their cultures, I linked up what they said and drove it right back to the element, the specific element in this infographic, so that hopefully that you can learn something from it. The last slide, Lori, and then we can get a couple questions, is how do you transform culture? And there's some complexity here, but ultimately you'll notice on the upper left-hand side, you can't transform culture unless you've got people, leaders in your association who are willing to be disrupted. And typically you do that through executive coaching. Some leaders don't want executive coaching. That's fine. But at least you need to do something around retreats where you're getting executives and the board to look inside and calibrate the strength and vibrancy of their inner core. That's step number 1. When I'm called in to work with an organization, that's the first step. We want to make sure the leadership team is as strong and vibrant as possible. And then we get into the aggregate work, the culture assessments, the engagement surveys. Are we truly ready to transform as an association? And then also down here, obviously feedback from members and so on and so forth, ultimately driving what we just talked about, but more from the association standpoint, and then ultimately driving on the upper right-hand side, what is this mission? What is this compelling future that we must become? And then the implementation of the 6 steps. The last thing, Lori, and everybody listening in, this is not a sprint. My experience and the research that I've done says that it takes about 2 to 3 years for a successful transformation to take hold, so that you actually disrupt the zone that used to be and create a whole new zone that is more pleasurable for you and everybody else. I'm going to stop right there, Lori.
Okay, and I encourage you guys to put in your questions in the chat box now. And I'm seeing lots of great comments here. Neil is saying nice, very good job. I liked someone else's comment. If it's not broke, break it, which talks to your point of disruption. That's Jadoy, thank you. So this is a question from Patricia. She says, sometimes improving culture is viewed as an HR assignment. So how do you get the C-suite to see this as a true bottom line imperative?
Yeah. Patricia, that's very, very true. And, in fact, I just wrote a piece for that's going to come out in Fast Company in about a month on just what you're talking about. You bring up a very, very good point. And what I was able to discover was that, CEOs, executive directors, there's a lot. It's a tough job. There's a lot of stuff going on. But ultimately, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book. All 14 of these CEOs, all 14 said their most important job's culture, the most important job. So a lot of it's going to come down to maybe sharing this presentation with your stakeholders, having a discussion, getting the needle moved around getting the senior team and the board to start to see that, in reality, if we get our culture right, our association is going to be incredibly strong and vibrant, and we're going to ensure our survival long term. And my experience is sometimes, getting books in people's hands so they can start to read the concepts, having brown bag lunches to talk about these constructs and these ideas is a good thing. Ultimately, you want to get it measuring. Once you measure your culture, and you do it using either a 5CCA tool that I've got or the Denison tool, that's a platform where everybody you can't contradict the data. So everybody can sit around and say, something, we're weak here, we're strong here, and that's where you go.
Right. Okay. And then here's a good question from Carolyn, and we'll probably have to end it there. So she's asking, it's talking about the emergent culture that comes from disrupting the disruption. So how do you lay out goals when the goal is to create new ones? And how do you do that without losing focus and clarity and getting distracted? How do you know what's right? Yeah.
Yeah, you got to measure. I think the first step for all of you is to calibrate these 5 cultures. That's going to give you a starting point. And what you're going to learn is, just like all companies and all associations that I work with, that there are elements in your culture that are actually operating well. You want to sustain those. You don't want to throw everything out. So what you want to do is you want to find those elements in your culture that you want to continue to sustain. But invariably, you're going to find elements in your culture that you need to laser focus in on. The courageous mindset is also very important, and that's why if the executive director and the board instills a climate in which people are willing to be passionate, and that's an element of courage, is being passionate, persistent, and willing to stand up for what they believe in professionally. Those are elements that all instigate positive action. It's certainly beyond a 1-hour webinar, but Lori, I am certainly available post-webinar to connect with everybody and anybody who wants to contact me, and we'll just have a conversation. I'm sure I can help.
That's great. Maybe we can share your email after. And I do have one question from Dawn. She's kind of asked it throughout the webinar, and she's begged me to ask you before you go. So you just talked about passion and, thinking big and doing all this stuff. And how would you do that in, say, a startup situation, or even in the association, small membership world, where the staff is quite small, or often it's one person doing everything? So how do you do all this without burning out and getting tired? And how do you just not fizzle away from thinking big all the time.
Not beautiful. It's beautiful. You know, it's actually the conceptual part of it is actually scary. You know what I'm saying? It does scare people and I do get that reaction sometimes. Boy, you know, this guy, the way he talks about it is, you know, we're gonna burn out. In fact, what we want to do is we want to get to the point where individually we start to recognize that this new path is actually the path that we're on actually generates more passion, more exhilaration than any other path that you can be on. Once you've got people in a pathway where they start to see that actually this new pathway is generating more pleasure, that's what's going to explode this thing out. So it's always tough early on, but even in the smaller associations, you want to create and instill the entrepreneurial mindset. And when you look at entrepreneurial mindsets and entrepreneur organizations, they're the ones that actually embrace those 6 constructs that we talked about before more than anything else. So I think whoever asked that question, you've got a great opportunity, I think, to create an incredible culture and be very successful with it.
I love it. And on that note, we'll end there. And I'm just going to take presenter control back. Thank you, John, so much for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Oops, sorry, I'm just showing.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, John. And everyone, before you go, I just want to let you know about our upcoming webinar, which is more on the volunteer recruitment aspect of things. And Barry Altland's going to join us for that. And he's really done some rethinking around the recruitment strategy so you can actually have more motivated leaders like we were just talking about. So definitely join us for that. That's February 11th, 2 weeks from now. And if you don't know about our e-course, we do have an e-course available at courses.wildapricot.com. Teaches you how to run more effective meetings, and there's tons of great stuff in there. We definitely recommend it. And finally, if you're new to Wild Apricot, we hold demos every Wednesday, and you can learn more about our software and maybe be courageous enough to present it to your board as a different way of operating. All right, that's my plug for the day. Thanks again, John, for joining us, and thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.